How to make people value and remember you for a long time. Think about the last funeral you attended. I know that's a heavy way to start, but stay with me. At that funeral, what did people talk about? Was it the deceased person's bank account, their social media following, their designer clothes or expensive car? Of course not. They talked about character. They shared stories about kindness, integrity, wisdom, and how this person made them feel. They remembered moments when this person showed up, when they were reliable, when they offered comfort or guidance. They remembered not what this person had, but who this person was. I had a wake-up call about this a few years ago. I was at a coffee shop scrolling through my phone when I overheard two people talking at the next table. One was telling the other about someone they'd worked with years ago. "You know," she said, "I can't even remember his name anymore, but I'll never forget how he always had time to listen. Whenever I was stressed or overwhelmed, he'd just sit there and really hear me out. He never tried to fix everything or give quick advice. He just listened. I still think about that sometimes when I'm having a rough day." That conversation hit me like a lightning bolt. Here was someone who had made such an impact that years later, even without remembering his name, this person was still carrying the gift of his presence. That's when I realized I'd been thinking about relationships and influence all wrong. We live in a world obsessed with being noticed, liked, and followed. We chase external validation, trying to be more interesting, more entertaining, more impressive. But the ancient Stoics understood something we've forgotten in our digital age. The people who leave lasting impressions, who are truly valued and remembered, aren't necessarily the loudest or most charismatic. They're the ones who embody certain timeless principles of character and wisdom. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who could have demanded attention and admiration from anyone, wrote in his private journal, "Remember that very little disturbs the happiness of life. It is neither wealth nor power nor beauty that make us happy, but virtue." The Stoics discovered that lasting influence comes not from what you project to the world, but from who you actually are when no one is watching. Today, I want to share with you 8 Stoic principles that will help you become someone people genuinely value and remember for a long time. These aren't tricks or manipulation tactics. They're not about becoming more likable or popular in the shallow sense. They're about developing the kind of character that naturally draws people to you and creates lasting, meaningful connections. The beautiful thing about the Stoic approach is that it's not about changing your personality or becoming someone you're not. It's about becoming the best version of who you already are. It's about developing inner qualities that shine through in every interaction, creating ripple effects that last long after you've left the room. The Stoic foundation of lasting value. Before we dive into specific practices, we need to understand the philosophical foundation that makes this approach so powerful. The Stoics had a radical insight about human nature and relationships that modern psychology is only now catching up to. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his Meditations, made a crucial distinction between reputation and character. "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does," he wrote, "but only to what he does himself." The emperor understood that when you focus on building genuine character rather than managing your image, you naturally become someone worth remembering. This isn't about being indifferent to others or not caring what people think. It's about recognizing that lasting influence comes from the inside out. When you're genuinely committed to virtue, wisdom, and service, it shows in everything you do. People sense authenticity, even when they can't articulate it. Epictetus, who started life as a slave and became one of history's most influential teachers, taught that we must distinguish between what is up to us and what is not up to us. You cannot control whether people like you, remember you, or value you. That's not up to you. But you can control your character, your actions, your responses, and your intentions. And paradoxically, when you focus entirely on what is up to you, you become exactly the kind of person others naturally want to be around. Think about the people in your own life who have had lasting influence on you. I bet they weren't trying to impress you. They weren't performing or putting on a show. They were simply being themselves at their best. They were consistent, authentic, and focused on something larger than their own ego. Seneca, the advisor to emperors and one of Rome's wealthiest men, wrote extensively about friendship and human connection. He understood that true friendship, the kind that lasts and matters, is built on virtue and mutual respect, not on entertainment or mutual benefit. The willing, destiny guides them. The unwilling, destiny drags them, he wrote, recognizing that the people who choose to develop their character naturally attract others who value depth and authenticity. The Stoic foundation for lasting influence rests on 3 pillars. First, focus on character over reputation. Second, control what you can control and accept what you cannot. Third, recognize that we're all connected and your actions ripple outward in ways you may never fully understand. When you internalize these principles, something magical happens. You stop trying so hard to be impressive and start becoming genuinely impressive. You stop worrying about whether people will remember you and start living in a way that's naturally memorable. You stop seeking value from others and start providing value to others. This shift in perspective is transformative because it aligns you with how relationships actually work at the deepest level. People don't remember you because you told them to. They remember you because you touched something real in their experience. You made them feel seen, heard, supported, or inspired. You showed them what's possible when someone commits to living with integrity and wisdom. The ancient Stoics knew that lasting influence isn't about having the perfect words or the most charismatic personality. It's about becoming the kind of person whose very presence makes others feel more capable of becoming their best selves. When you embody Stoic virtues, you naturally become someone others want to learn from, confide in, and be around. Character over charisma. Here's a truth that might make you uncomfortable. Charisma without character is just manipulation with better marketing. We live in a culture that celebrates charismatic personalities, but the Stoics understood that sustainable influence comes from something much deeper and more reliable than charm. I learned this lesson the hard way early in my career. I worked with someone who could light up any room he entered. He was funny, engaging, and seemed to effortlessly connect with everyone. People loved being around him, at least initially. But over time, a pattern emerged. His promises were rarely kept. His enthusiasm was genuine in the moment, but faded quickly when it came time to do the actual work. His charm was real, but it wasn't backed by substance. Eventually, people started to see through the performance. What had once felt exciting and magnetic began to feel hollow and unreliable. The same charisma that had drawn people to him became a source of disappointment when they realized it wasn't connected to consistent character. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good person should be. Be one." The emperor understood that character isn't about grand gestures or impressive speeches. It's about the accumulation of small, consistent choices that reveal who you really are when the spotlight isn't on you. Character shows up in how you handle the mundane moments. Do you keep your word when it's inconvenient? Do you show up on time even when no one will notice if you're late? Do you treat the janitor with the same respect you show the CEO? Do you admit your mistakes even when you could probably get away with covering them up? These small moments of integrity are what people actually remember. They might not consciously catalogue every instance of your reliability, but they develop an unconscious sense of trust. They know they can count on you, even if they can't pinpoint exactly why they feel that way. Epictetus, despite his difficult background, became someone that people sought out for wisdom and guidance. His influence wasn't based on his social status or natural charisma. It was based on his unwavering commitment to living according to his principles. Students traveled from across the Roman Empire to learn from him, not because he was entertaining, but because he embodied the wisdom he taught. Character-based influence has a different quality than charisma-based influence. Charismatic people often leave you feeling energized about them. People of character leave you feeling energized about yourself and what you're capable of becoming. Charismatic people draw attention to themselves. People of character draw out the best in others. This doesn't mean you should be boring or avoid developing your communication skills. The Stoics weren't advocating for dullness. They were advocating for substance. When you build your influence on character first, any natural charm or communication ability you have becomes a vehicle for something meaningful rather than an end in itself. Consider how you can apply this in your daily interactions. Instead of trying to be the most interesting person in the room, focus on being the most interested. Instead of looking for opportunities to impress, look for opportunities to serve. Instead of trying to be memorable through cleverness or humor alone, be memorable through consistency and dependability. The beautiful thing about character-based influence is that it's available to everyone, regardless of your natural personality type. You don't need to be naturally outgoing or witty. You don't need to be the smartest person in the room. You just need to be committed to doing the right thing, especially when it's difficult or when no one is watching. People remember authenticity. They remember reliability. They remember someone who made them feel safe to be themselves. They remember someone who could be trusted with their vulnerabilities. They remember someone whose actions match their words, whose private character matched their public persona. When you focus on character over charisma, you're playing a longer game. Charismatic influence often peaks quickly and then fades. Character-based influence builds slowly, but lasts for decades. The people who influenced you most deeply probably weren't the flashiest people you knew. They were the ones who showed you what integrity looks like in action, the power of genuine interest in others. The Stoics believed in a concept called sympatheia, the idea that all things are interconnected in a web of mutual influence and dependence. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What is not good for the hive cannot be good for the bee." This understanding of our fundamental interconnectedness naturally leads to one of the most powerful ways to become valued and remembered, developing genuine interest in other people. Most of us go through our days focused primarily on our own concerns, our own problems, our own goals. This is natural and not necessarily selfish, but it limits our ability to create meaningful connections. The people who stand out, who are remembered fondly years later, are those who somehow manage to make you feel like you're the most important person in the room when you're talking with them. I once had a brief conversation with someone at a conference that I still think about years later. I was feeling overwhelmed and a bit out of place at this event full of people who seemed more accomplished than me. This person, who I later learned was quite successful in his field, sat down next to me during a break and simply asked, "How are you finding the conference so far?" But here's what made it memorable. He actually listened to my answer. He didn't use my response as a jumping-off point to talk about his own experience. He didn't glance around the room looking for more important people to talk to. He gave me his complete attention for those few minutes, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and made me feel like my perspective mattered. That interaction probably lasted less than 10 minutes, but it changed how I felt about myself and the entire event. More importantly, it showed me what genuine interest in another person looks like and how powerful it can be. Seneca understood this principle deeply. In his letters to his friend Lucilius, he demonstrates how to be genuinely interested in another person's growth and well-being. He asks thoughtful questions, offers relevant wisdom, and shows consistent care for Lucilius's development as a person. These letters have been read and treasured for 2,000 years, partly because they model what it looks like to truly invest in another person's flourishing. Genuine interest goes far beyond small talk and social niceties. It means being curious about what makes someone tick, what challenges they're facing, what they're learning, what they're excited about. It means remembering details from previous conversations and following up on things that were important to them. But here's the key. This interest must be authentic. People can sense when your attention is performative or when you're just waiting for your turn to talk. The Stoic approach to relationships is grounded in virtue, which means your interest in others must come from a genuine place of caring, not from a desire to manipulate or impress. How do you develop this genuine interest? Start by recognizing that every person you meet has a complex inner life full of hopes, fears, dreams, and struggles. Everyone has overcome challenges you know nothing about. Everyone has insights and experiences that could teach you something if you're willing to listen. Practice what I call investigative curiosity. When someone mentions they're dealing with a difficult situation, instead of immediately offering advice or relating it to your own experience, ask questions that help you understand their perspective better. What's the hardest part about that for you? How are you thinking about approaching it? What would success look like in this situation? Remember that being genuinely interested doesn't mean being intrusive or prying into areas where you're not welcome. It means being attuned to what someone is willing to share and responding with appropriate curiosity and care. One of the most powerful ways to show genuine interest is to remember and follow up on things people tell you. If someone mentions they're nervous about a presentation next week, remember to ask how it went when you see them again. If they're dealing with a sick family member, check in periodically to see how everyone is doing. These small acts of remembrance show that your conversations matter to you and that you see them as a whole person, not just someone to interact with in the moment. The Stoic concept of sympathia reminds us that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. When you genuinely invest in other people's well-being and success, you're not just being nice, you're acknowledging the fundamental truth of our interconnectedness. What's good for them is ultimately good for the whole community, which includes you. People remember those who saw them clearly and cared about them authentically. They remember conversations where they felt heard and understood. They remember someone who took a genuine interest in their growth and happiness without expecting anything in return. Mastering your reactions and emotions. Nothing reveals character quite like how you handle pressure, disappointment, and conflict. The Stoics understood that your ability to maintain composure and respond thoughtfully, rather than react impulsively, is one of the most valuable gifts you can offer to any relationship. When you become someone others can count on to remain steady in turbulent times, you become invaluable. Epictetus taught that it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. This isn't about suppressing your emotions or pretending to be unaffected by difficult situations. It's about developing the inner resources to choose your response rather than being controlled by your immediate impulses. I witnessed this principle in action during a particularly stressful period at a previous job. Our team was under intense pressure to meet an unrealistic deadline, and tensions were running high. Most of us were snapping at each other, complaining constantly, and letting the stress poison our interactions. But one team member seemed to maintain her equilibrium throughout the chaos. She didn't pretend the situation wasn't stressful. She acknowledged the difficulty, but consistently responded to setbacks with practical problem-solving rather than emotional venting. When others were panicking, she asked clarifying questions. When conflicts arose, she looked for common ground. When mistakes happened, she focused on solutions rather than blame. Years later, when I think about that period, I mostly remember the stress and dysfunction. But I also remember her steady presence and how much calmer I felt when working directly with her. She became someone the whole team unconsciously relied on for stability. Her ability to manage her own emotional reactions made her invaluable to everyone around her. Marcus Aurelius faced enormous pressures as Emperor of Rome, dealing with wars, plagues, political intrigue, and personal tragedies. Yet his private writings reveal someone committed to maintaining his inner equilibrium, regardless of external circumstances. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," he wrote. "Realize this, and you will find strength." This doesn't mean becoming emotionally disconnected or indifferent. The Stoics valued appropriate emotions and natural human responses, but they distinguished between initial impressions and considered responses. You might feel angry when someone treats you unfairly, but you can choose whether to lash out or respond in a way that's more likely to resolve the situation constructively. Your emotional regulation becomes a gift to everyone around you. When you remain calm in crisis, you give others permission to access their own clarity. When you respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, you model how to have productive, difficult conversations. When you handle disappointment with grace, you show others that setbacks don't have to define us. This is particularly powerful in professional settings. The person who can receive harsh feedback without becoming defensive, who can navigate office politics without getting drawn into drama, who can handle high-pressure situations without losing their composure, becomes someone others actively want to work with. They become known as someone who makes difficult situations easier rather than harder. But emotional mastery isn't just about managing negative emotions. It's also about expressing positive emotions authentically and appropriately. Stoics weren't emotionless robots. They were people who had developed the wisdom to know when and how to express their feelings in ways that served the situation and the relationship. The key is developing what Aristotle called the golden mean between emotional extremes. You want to be neither emotionally reactive nor emotionally disconnected. You want to feel your emotions fully while maintaining the perspective and wisdom to choose your responses consciously. One practical way to develop this skill is to practice the Stoic exercise of the view from above. When you're in the middle of a stressful or emotional situation, imagine viewing it from a broader perspective. How will this matter in a week? In a year? In a decade? This isn't about minimizing your feelings, but about maintaining perspective that helps you respond wisely rather than just react. Another powerful practice is the pause between stimulus and response. When something happens that triggers a strong emotional reaction, create a brief pause before responding. Take a breath. Ask yourself what response would serve the situation best. What would wisdom look like in this moment? People remember those who could stay centered when everyone else was losing their heads. They remember someone who could be counted on to bring clarity to confusion, calm to chaos, and wisdom to emotional turbulence. They remember someone whose presence made them feel more capable of handling their own challenges. When you master your reactions and emotions, you become a source of stability in an unstable world. You become someone others trust with their own vulnerabilities because they know you won't respond with judgment or drama. You become memorable not for your emotional outbursts, but for your emotional wisdom, the art of selfless service. One of the most counterintuitive paths to being valued and remembered is to stop trying to get value from others and instead focus entirely on providing value to them. The Stoics understood that true fulfillment and lasting influence come from dedicating yourself to something larger than your own immediate interests. Marcus Aurelius, despite being the most powerful man in the world, saw his role as one of service. "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee," he wrote, recognizing that his own well-being was inextricably linked to the well-being of those he served. This wasn't about self-sacrifice in the sense of martyrdom. It was about understanding that lasting satisfaction comes from contributing to something meaningful. The most memorable people in your life probably aren't those who asked the most from you, but those who gave the most to you. Not necessarily in terms of material gifts, but in terms of time, attention, wisdom, support, or opportunities. They made your life better in some way without keeping score or expecting immediate reciprocation. I think about a teacher I had in college who would stay after class to help struggling students, not because it was required, but because she genuinely cared about our learning. She remembered details about our individual challenges and goals. She connected us with resources and opportunities. She wrote recommendation letters and made introductions. She did all of this while teaching a full course load and conducting her own research. Years later, when I run into former classmates, her name invariably comes up in our conversations. We all remember specific ways she helped us, specific moments when her support made a difference. She became unforgettable not through any dramatic gesture, but through consistent acts of service that showed she was genuinely invested in our success. Seneca wrote extensively about the joy that comes from helping others succeed. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, he observed, recognizing that our individual growth and happiness are interconnected with the growth and happiness of others. When you help someone else succeed, you're not diminishing your own potential, you're expanding it. This principle works in every area of life. In professional settings, the people who get promoted and remembered aren't usually those who hoard information or compete ruthlessly with their colleagues. They're the ones who share knowledge freely, mentor others, and look for ways to make their entire team more successful. In personal relationships, the friends who last are those who show up consistently, who celebrate your successes without jealousy, who support you through difficulties without judgment, who remember what matters to you and act on that knowledge. But here's the crucial distinction. Genuine service can't be strategic or manipulative. If you're helping others primarily to build your own reputation or to create obligations, people will sense that agenda, and it will undermine the very influence you're trying to build. The service must be genuine, driven by authentic care for others' well-being. The Stoics called this attitude sympathia, the recognition that we're all connected, and that what serves the common good ultimately serves our individual good as well. When you operate from this perspective, service becomes natural rather than forced. You help others not because you're trying to be remembered, but because it's the right thing to do. This doesn't mean being a doormat or saying yes to every request. Wisdom involves knowing when and how to help in ways that truly serve others, rather than enabling dysfunction or dependency. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is to say no or to refuse to rescue someone from consequences they need to experience. Effective service often happens in small, seemingly insignificant moments. Making an introduction between two people who could help each other. Sharing an article or resource that might be useful to someone. Offering encouragement when someone is doubting themselves. Taking time to really listen when someone needs to talk through a problem. The key is to pay attention to the needs and opportunities around you and to respond when you can make a genuine contribution. This requires getting out of your own head and your own concerns long enough to notice what others are dealing with and what you might have to offer. When you consistently look for ways to add value to others' lives, something remarkable happens. You become known as someone who makes things better. People start thinking of you when opportunities arise because they know you're someone who contributes rather than just consumes. You become memorable not for what you've achieved, but for what you've helped others achieve. The beautiful paradox of service is that when you stop trying to get value from relationships and focus entirely on providing value, you naturally become more valuable to everyone around you. You become someone people want to work with, confide in, and keep in their lives for the long term. Wisdom in speech and silence. The ancient Stoics understood that how you use words, and when you choose not to use them, reveals everything about your character and wisdom. Epictetus taught that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the power of thoughtful speech versus the damage of careless words. Your words have the power to build people up or tear them down, to create clarity or confusion, to inspire action or paralyze with fear. The people who are remembered fondly are usually those who knew how to speak in ways that helped rather than harmed, who offered wisdom when it was needed and silence when that was more appropriate. I learned this lesson from watching my grandmother interact with people throughout her life. She had a remarkable ability to know exactly what to say and when to say it. When someone was struggling, she somehow found words that offered comfort without minimizing their pain. When someone was excited about an achievement, she celebrated with them without making it about herself. When conflicts arose, she often said nothing at all, allowing tensions to diffuse naturally rather than escalating them with her own opinions. People sought her out for advice, but she rarely gave it directly. Instead, she asked questions that helped people discover their own wisdom. She had mastered the art of being helpful with words without being pushy or controlling. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius, "Let all your efforts be directed to something. Let it keep that end in view. It's not activity that disturbs people, but false conceptions of things that drive them mad." This applies perfectly to how we use language. When your words are directed toward truth, helpfulness, and genuine care for others, they have power to heal and inspire. When they're driven by ego, fear, or the need to be right, they often cause more harm than good. One of the most valuable verbal skills you can develop is the ability to ask better questions. Instead of rushing to give answers or share your own experience, learn to ask questions that help people think more clearly about their situations. What do you think is the real issue here? What would have to be true for this to work out the way you want? What are you most concerned about in this situation? Good questions show that you're genuinely interested in understanding rather than just waiting for your turn to talk. They help people process their own thoughts and often lead them to insights they wouldn't have reached through advice alone. Equally important is knowing when to remain silent. The Stoics valued the wisdom of restraint in speech. Not every thought needs to be expressed. Not every observation needs to be shared. Not every conversation needs your input. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply listen without trying to fix, advise, or relate the conversation back to your own experience. When someone is processing difficult emotions or working through a challenging decision, your silent presence and attention can be more valuable than any words you might offer. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Be like the rocky headland on which the waves constantly break. It stands firm, and round it the seething waters are laid to rest." Sometimes being memorable means being the steady, quiet presence that others can count on, rather than the person who always has something to say. When you do speak, make your words count. Choose them carefully. Consider their impact not just on the immediate conversation, but on the relationship and the other person's sense of themselves. Will your words build confidence or create doubt? Will they clarify or confuse? Will they encourage growth or reinforce limitations? This doesn't mean being artificially positive or avoiding difficult conversations. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is to speak difficult truths. But even then, the Stoic approach emphasizes speaking from wisdom and care rather than anger or superiority. One practical exercise is to pause before speaking in emotionally charged situations and ask yourself, is what I'm about to say true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? If the answer to any of these questions is no, consider whether silence might be wiser. The people who are remembered for their words are usually not those who talked the most, but those who spoke with intention and wisdom. They knew how to offer encouragement that felt genuine, criticism that felt constructive, and questions that opened up new possibilities. When you master the art of thoughtful speech and strategic silence, you become someone others trust with their thoughts and feelings. You become known as someone whose words carry weight because they're chosen carefully and offered with genuine care for the listener's well-being. Living your values consistently. The final, and perhaps most important principle, is the one that ties everything else together: the unwavering commitment to live according to your deepest values, regardless of external pressures or changing circumstances. The Stoics called this integrity, and they understood it as the foundation of all lasting influence and respect. Marcus Aurelius faced enormous pressures to compromise his principles. As emperor, he could have easily used his power for personal gain, avoided difficult decisions, or prioritized popular approval over doing what he believed was right. Instead, his writings reveal someone constantly working to align his actions with his values, even when it was difficult or costly. "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy," he wrote, recognizing that maintaining your integrity is more important than winning any particular conflict or gaining any temporary advantage. This perspective creates a different kind of influence, one based on respect rather than fear, admiration rather than envy. People remember those who stood for something, especially when standing was difficult. They remember someone who kept their word even when circumstances changed. They remember someone who treated others with respect, even when those others couldn't help or harm them. They remember someone whose private character matched their public persona. I think about a business leader I worked with who had built a company based on treating employees exceptionally well. When the company hit financial difficulties, he had tremendous pressure from investors to cut benefits and lay off staff. Instead, he took a significant pay cut himself, found creative ways to reduce costs without affecting employees, and was completely transparent with the team about the challenges they were facing. The company survived that difficult period, but what people remember isn't just that it survived. They remember how their leader chose to handle the crisis in a way that was consistent with his stated values. Years later, many of those employees are still with the company, and others have moved on to spread the word about what it's like to work for someone who truly lives their values. Epictetus, who understood better than most what it meant to have no control over external circumstances, taught that our character is the one thing that truly belongs to us. "Wealth consists in not having great possessions," he said, "but in having few wants." This perspective freed him to focus entirely on what he could control: his responses, his choices, and his commitment to living according to wisdom and virtue. Living your values consistently doesn't mean being rigid or inflexible. It means having core principles that guide your decisions and being willing to adapt your methods while staying true to your fundamental commitments. It means admitting when you've fallen short of your own standards and making corrections rather than making excuses. One of the most powerful aspects of consistent values-based living is that it creates predictability in an unpredictable world. When people know what you stand for, they know what to expect from you. They can trust you in situations where they might not trust others because they understand your underlying motivations and commitments. This predictability becomes especially valuable in leadership positions. When team members know that their leader will consistently prioritize honesty, fairness, and the team's well-being, they can focus their energy on doing great work rather than trying to figure out hidden agendas or protect themselves from betrayal. But values-based living isn't just about big moral stands or leadership positions. It shows up in everyday interactions. Do you keep your commitments even when they become inconvenient? Do you treat service workers with the same respect you show to influential people? Do you tell the truth even when a small lie would be easier? Do you give credit where it's due even when you could take it yourself? These small moments of integrity accumulate over time to create a reputation for trustworthiness that becomes one of your most valuable assets. People know they can count on you to do what you say you'll do, to be who you say you are, and to act in ways that are consistent with the values you profess. The Stoic path to being valued and remembered isn't about perfection. Even Marcus Aurelius struggled with living up to his own ideals and wrote about his failures and shortcomings. The goal isn't to be perfect, It's to be authentic in your commitment to growth and consistently oriented toward virtue and wisdom. When you commit to living your values regardless of external pressures, you become someone others can admire without reservation. You become a reference point for what's possible when someone commits to integrity and wisdom. You become memorable not for what you achieved, but for who you were and how you lived. People may forget your words and even your actions, but they never forget how you made them feel about themselves and about what's possible in human relationships. When you consistently embody the values you believe in, you give others a gift that lasts long after you're gone, the example of a life lived with intention, integrity, and wisdom. The ancient Stoics discovered that the path to lasting influence and genuine respect isn't found in tricks or techniques, but in the patient cultivation of character. When you commit to this path, you become not just someone who is remembered, but someone worth remembering,